After great Queen Nayeli Arana passed away, Akatan entered a time that could only be described as nationwide confusion. The queen might have been dead, but that did not stop her spirit from appearing from time to time to guide her successor and granddaughter Kisa. In fact, Old Queen appeared in such bizarre times and places sometimes that her visits became almost impossible to hide, and soon wild rumors started to circle around the floating city and later around the rest of the country. Some claimed that Kisa was just an empty vessel that ghost of Queen Nayeli would possess and control one day. Others believed that Old Queen was kept in this world by her own determination and devotion to her mission and protected Kisa from harm, be it in form of foreign invasions or disloyal supporters. Still though, whether or not any of these rumors were true, the fact was that the situation was confusing for everyone, the new queen and her council included. Kisa took power when she was barely 6 years old, and had almost no idea on how to run the country, especially since Nayeli never really interacted with her granddaughter, at least not until the last few months of her life. As such, she was forced to rely on a council of regents, officials, priests and nobles loyal to her granddaughter to teach her everything she needed to know, and to ensure that the country would be kept in one piece until she could take full control of it. But at the same time, both she and her councillors had to contend with visits from Nayeli's spirit that constantly reminded them to abandon all other goals and focus solely on returning to Yucatan Peninsula and restoring their motherland. As such, Kisa began extensive education, spending her days cooped up in the palace, surrounded by scholars and officials who ran her kingdom. The council, on the other hand, set off to keep the country stable. All hopes of using Kisa for their own needs were dropped in the very moment Queen Nayeli appeared beside her granddaughter and proclaimed that she would protect her. After that, not one of the councillors even dared to think about betraying young Kisa's trust. So, as Kisa sat in her chambers and listened to never-ending lessons on how to be a perfect queen, some of these lessons prepared beforehand by Nayeli herself, the Regency Council kept the state going. After long deliberations, the councillors decided that the best way to preserve Akatan's stability was to isolate the nation from outside influences, at least for a few years. As such, they recalled most of their diplomatic delegations, restricted trade with continental powers, and recalled most of their expeditions. Only those exploring the great oceans to the east were kept operational, in hopes of, eventually, finding a way back home. But at the same time, another revolution was being prepared, though not in the palace, but in the royal temple. Shortly before her death, Nayeli shared the truth of her findings during that fated expedition to the north with some of the most loyal priests and bureaucrats. She told them the whole story about wicked, malicious power that took control over their homeland, and of their true gods that were defeated and forced to flee to frozen wastes of Siberia where, cut off from their followers, they slowly waned and lost all of their power. It was a terrifying realization for many of Nayeli's advisors, to learn that deities they prayed to for all their lives were nothing else but long-forgotten husks, either dead or so close to death that they possessed no godly power one would expect from them. But while this revelation was a shock, it also allowed mortals of Akatan to devise some kind of counter-strategy. Sharing the truth with the public was out of the question. It would have to happen sooner or later, but for now it could only end up in chaos. So instead, priests of the royal temple decided to develop another plan. They claimed that there was no use to pray to their gods anymore. After all, they were dead, so could no longer make use of power given to them by said prayers. In fact, there was a decent possibility that all sacrifices made by Akatani people were still taken by the unnamed force of evil that took their homeland, so giving it even more power was not exactly a great idea. So, instead of praying to gods old and new, the priests simply added few more figures into the pantheon and formed the so-called Arana cult, focused on the royal family of Akatan and now legendary Scholar King of Itza. None of these people were to be treated as deities though. The Scholar King of Itza was to be hailed as Prophet of New Spring, the first soul that realized the mortal danger Mayan people were in, and first human to stand up to the malicious power that fed on chaos. The Arana family, on the other hand, were to be hailed as divine champions, chosen of the gods, who now wielded their wisdom and power, in form of divine crown found in Siberia, in order to lead the counterattack that would remove all corrupted presence from Yucatan Peninsula, and from the rest of the world as well. As such, in this new cult, all prayers and all sacrifices were directed not at the gods, but at their earthly champions, in hopes that they would use the power of their believers to deliver Akatani people to an ultimate victory over evil. Whether or not that plan worked is debatable, to say the least, but it was clear that this new cult would prove extremely useful to ensure stability of the nation, as it further increased influence of the royal family and reminded people to focus on their main goal, instead of acting for their own selfish needs. And, perhaps most importantly, the cult would also ensure that the royal family was focused on their duty as well, for, after all, they were not just some random regional warlords anymore. They were champions of the gods, chosen to banish evil from this world. If they failed, repercussions would surely be grave for everyone, and so complacency was out of the question. But while adults formed their schemes and plans and kept the nation walking, young Kisa grew old enough to actually start understanding everything that was going on around her. And with that understanding came questioning, and with questioning the youthful rebellion. Or perhaps it would be better to say that Kisa simply started to find her own way in life, one in which she could be true both to her duty and to herself. As years went by, she started to skip her tutoring lessons more and more, to sneak out of the palace and into the floating city where her true interests lied. All these lessons about administration, about taxes and economy, all of it bored Kisa out of her mind, and she often stated that as a fully appointed queen, she would delegate all that work to her subordinates. Instead, her interests were more adventurous, to say the least. When she sneaked out of the palace, she could usually be found in one of three places: in the port, where she stared wide-eyed and excited at ships as they arrived and departed, always dreaming about mysterious lands beyond Akatan's borders. Not just about old Mayan motherland though, for in truth Yucatan meant very little to her, but also about other nations much closer to her home, but still distant in terms of understanding. In other times, she would sneak to barracks of the Royal Guard and observe her soldiers training with their powerful Zantican firearms. But as she grew older, she found another place, Akatan's many newly opened foundries, where she could stay for hours watching blacksmiths mold metal into weapons and tools. Something about the clank of steel and din of forges spoke to Kisa's heart, and very soon she directed almost all of her attention towards metalworking. She would spend hours alone in her room with divine crown on her head, trying to find new ways of using iron and steel, either in peace or in war. By the time she reached her early teenage years, Kisa was so obsessed with metalworking that she ordered a special foundry to be constructed on palace grounds, where she experimented almost every day. At first, these experiments were simple ones, but after a while, when paired with divine crown and Kisa's own interest in firearms, started to become actually beneficial for the nation as a whole. Backed by God's wisdom, the Queen wanted to create better, more devastating weapons, preferably ones that could completely decimate enemies before they could react. At first, she worked mostly with regular Zantican guns, but after a while the young queen and her scholars realized that, with a bit of creative metalworking, they could increase the scale of their new weapons by a significant amount, so significant that nothing, not even mighty fortresses of Nippon clans, could withstand their earth-shaking power. Thus began another series of experiments that, in the end, resulted in creation of first of the famous, or infamous, depending on one's point of view, brass thunderers. Simply put, these were greatly upscaled Zantican guns, capable of launching large, heavy rounds of metal at tremendous speeds. What's more, unlike regular firearms, they could be raised to fire at an angle and rain death upon Akatan's enemies, even if they were behind cover or in a fortress. Of course, like with regular handguns, actual efficiency of brass thunderers was, at least at first, rather questionable. A single tiny mistake made during production could cause the weapon to explode, killing the crew that operated it and everyone around them. Accuracy was unpredictable at best, and some reports of friendly fire survived to modern times, carefully hidden amongst endless paperwork of the kingdom. But the sheer, destructive potential of these weapons could not be overstated. When they managed to hit their target, that target was in most cases gone or shattered into thousands little pieces. Buildings could not withstand it, fortified walls could barely take 1 or 2 shots, and its effects on regular troops was too graphic to put into words. But despite all that, or perhaps because of all that, these new weapons were considered as a vast step forward when it came to military technology, and presented yet another advantage soldiers of Akatan could bring to the field against their foes. And so, when Kisa was finally inaugurated as queen in the year 1512, she was the very first ruler whose coronation was celebrated with an echoing salvo of Akatan's finest brass thunderers. Although, perhaps in Kisa's case, she presented these weapons during her coronation to distract all the crowds that attended it from something a bit more complicated. For, during the ceremony, Kisa also presented a new heir to Akatan's throne, a boy by the name of Apop-Achi. Although how exactly did Kisa manage to become a mother of 2-year-old boy by the age of 15? Well, perhaps it's one of the questions that are better left unanswered. After all, the succession was safe, and Divine Crown recognized young Achi as a true heir of Arana bloodline. The mission could continue. Nothing else mattered. Still, despite becoming a true queen, Kisa continued to pursue her hobbies and became renowned as one of the most vocal supporters of military improvements. She and her scholars already created brass thunderers, which were slowly being implemented into the army, but the queen was also eager to improve her more regular troops by introducing a new series of laws that turned local militias and levies into semi-permanent, mostly professional forces. The goal there was to reduce reliance on old system of levies and create an army that could train at all times and be ready at a moment's notice in case of hostile invasion. What's more, it allowed Kisa's scholars to monitor progress of military trainings and correct all mistakes or inefficiencies, as well as develop new weapons better suited for her soldiers. This last part was especially pushed by the queen herself as well. After introducing Xantican guns to the army, many warchiefs became complacent, thinking that these new weapons were a pinnacle of military science. But, as was said, Xantis were not exactly reliable, which is precisely why Kisa and her wisest advisors worked daily to develop even more powerful guns to ensure Akatan's dominance on the battlefield. But at the same time, Queen Kisa's curiosity about foreign lands could finally be satisfied. After she took power from the Regency Council, she officially ended their isolationist policies and once again dispatched merchants and explorers in all directions to learn more about the world, and, with luck, to make some profit at the same time. Except this time, these expeditions were much larger and far better organized. Under Kisa's guidance, new, specially designed ships were constructed specifically for long-distance naval exploration, as they could carry more supplies and crew. The crews themselves became better organized as well, as Royal Ministry of the Navy began a series of training courses and hired renowned explorers that proved their skills in the past. With such backing, and generous donation from the crown itself, these explorers could now depart on far-reaching journeys and, assuming they found land, could use their newly developed skills to sustain their travels for months or even years without returning home to resupply. Of course, most of these expeditions were sent to the east to find a way home, but other, smaller ones departed in all directions, eager to find new lands, new trading partners, and, hopefully, new places that could be colonized. And it didn't take long for these expeditions to bear fruit. Mere few months after first explorers departed, some reports started reaching home about areas that could prove beneficial if added to Akatan's crown. The first one of such places was an island chain located far to the south of Nippon, in an otherwise dreadful emptiness of the Great Ocean. Individually, these islands were not overly useful, as some of them lacked even a single source of drinking water, but together, the chain could prove beneficial for the kingdom, especially thanks to the island that locals called Guam, which was the largest one in the area. For one, these islands could serve as a base for any future expeditions and store supplies needed for longer journeys. Additionally, the climate on them was warmer and much closer to the one back in Yucatan Peninsula, at least according to historical records, as no one from Old Motherland was alive at this point. Still, it meant that people of Akatan could use these warm islands to grow crops that could not survive in Hokkaido or Siberia, which would no doubt prove useful in their expansion. But while these expeditions were planned and then carried out, back in the north, first Akatani settlers reached the area that Queen Nayeli and her soldiers explored during their fated expedition. Some tried to move into the dead area around God's tomb, but only a handful managed to return, and even then, those survivors were almost always sick and then died within months of their misguided expeditions. In the end, only a handful of small settlements were established in the area, mostly along the coast, but it was not uncommon for their inhabitants to sometimes vanish without a trace, perhaps lured into the dead zone by mysterious light located in its center. Or perhaps the truth was much more mundane, and those settlements simply suffered from being located at the inhospitable, dark, and almost perpetually frozen edge of the world. Colonial life was not an easy one even in mild climates, so it's certainly possible that these settlers simply perished because of their own mistakes or poor planning. Still, no matter how many of these settlements vanished, new ones always emerged, usually established by more religious colonists. After all, this was the area where Queen Nayeli received her revelation and her divine crown. It was, as many believed, the place where gods themselves walked on earth, and so their devout followers would suffer through any discomfort just to be closer to them. Alas, the gods were not the only concern for people of Akatan, for a far more mundane, but at the same time far more dangerous issue arose at their very doorstep. For years now, Mayan refugees believed that their conflicts with clans of Nippon were over, as their own power grew, while the clans continued to fight between each other, making any invasions of Hokkaido impossible. But this suddenly changed when Shogun Ashikaga defeated several of the northern clans, including Uesugi, the long-standing rivals of Akatan, and united around half of the island under one banner. Suddenly, a large number of weak rivals was replaced with a single powerful one, and as months went by, reports from the south clearly indicated that the shogun was not willing to just allow Akatan to exist right under his nose. In fact, as threats from the south became more frequent, Akatani Crown decided to prepare as best as they could. Dozens of brass thunderers were ordered, and the foundry set off to work to prepare this massive artillery battery in hopes that its mere presence will be enough to dissuade shogunate forces from trying to invade. But in case they didn't, Queen Kisa ordered a secondary construction project, one of about a dozen galleys. Ashikaga fleet was relatively powerful and numerous, but at this point, especially with their new naval cannons, their Mayan counterparts could stand up to them, especially with all the experience they got from their expeditions. However, up until now, Akatani Navy never really engaged in a true battle. The closest they got to it was hunting pirates, but it could not compare to actual pitched engagement between two fleets. As such, Royal Court decided to counter their reservations by ordering over a dozen of new galleys, so that Mayan forces could easily outnumber fleets of Nippon, even in a situation in which the shogun would call all of his vassals to join him. The hope there was that the very threat of such a large fleet would be enough to prevent any declarations of war, although, as we all know, such thinking almost always turns out to be nothing more but a naive dream. But, perhaps in a move that was supposed to improve morale of the sailors who anxiously awaited their first true battle, Queen Kisa also created a new banner for her fleet, a large blue flag with sun at its center, symbolizing Akatan's new rising from darkness of winter. and in the middle of that sun, a watchful eye of the gods and their earthly champions, the Arana family, to remind sailors that someone is always watching over them, and that no matter how hard the road ahead may be, their efforts are not in vain. And when this flag was presented to the sailors, they responded by raising an echoing cheer, honored by such a tribute. In fact, the flag itself became so popular that its variants were adopted by the nation itself. The army received a new banner as well, very similar to the naval one but without the blue field that symbolized the ocean and the sky. Instead, Akatani's sun was placed on a field of black on army banners, to serve as a warning to all those who would oppose Mayan forces that only darkness of the underworld awaited them should they dare to raise their hands against those who tried to restore the world. But banners themselves, spectacular as they were not enough to win a war, and so military preparations continued at full speed. Dockyards continued to build new galleys and repair all damage older ones suffered in their previous patrol missions. Foundries worked day and night to produce more cannons and firearms for the army, and the soldiers were relentlessly drilled to prepare for an eventual attack. Akatani budget became dangerously strained by all this militarization, but the Queen and her court were determined to keep their current course. After all, they were not the only ones who advanced their knowledge of warfare since the last invasion, and so it was better to prepare and tighten the belts for a few years than risk being wiped out in a single battle. But while these military preparations took place, back in the floating city, Queen Kisa also continued reforms that were started by her mother. In order to increase her own grip on the nation, Nayeli greatly reduced power of old nobility and priests and handed most of the official government positions to commoners who were first and foremost loyal to her. But that proved to be a suboptimal decision in terms of efficiency. It was true that a large percentage of the nobles and priests were entitled fools with very little in terms of actual skills, but it was also undeniable that some of them were truly highly trained, talented and experienced individuals who could be very much useful to the crown. As such, instead of preventing them from raising up the ranks, Kisa decided to make the best use of them, and anyone else who could prove beneficial for their mission, by introducing a new law of meritocratic recruitment. In short, like its name suggests, it was supposed to ensure that only the most skilled individuals could receive highest government positions, regardless of their social status. It was a simple move that not only helped bridge the gap between old elites and commoners, but also encouraged both sides to constantly strive to improve themselves. Of course, it also created a fierce and ruthless competition between potential candidates, one that occasionally led to some serious troubles, but in truth, Queen Kisa silently approved of this ruthlessness. Perhaps it was her half-Siberian blood speaking, but Her Majesty believed that without constant struggle and challenges, her people would grow complacent and lazy. And so, from the next year onwards, all government officials had to constantly strive to prove themselves, or risk being overshadowed and replaced by their more skilled counterparts. But as expected, very soon a delegation from Kyoto arrived in the floating city, and, as everyone feared, they have not sailed there to proclaim friendship. As soon as their ship docked in the port, a delegation of soldiers marched down from it and demanded audience with the Queen. They have brought an ultimatum from Shogun himself. Their master wanted Akatan to hand over control of Oshima at the southern edge of Hokkaido. Trying to avoid escalation, the Queen asked what military ruler of all Nippon was willing to offer in return, to which the answer was that he would refrain from putting every single Mayan to the sword. It was clear then. The delegation was nothing more but a declaration of war, and a peaceful resolution was never an option. With regret, Kisa declined the offer and wished soldiers of Nippon a safe journey, but mere minutes after the ship left port, a rider approached her with grim news. Shogunate fleet was already spotted moving into Tsugaru Strait, where it took position to block any movement between Hokkaido and Nippon, and, without a doubt, to secure a way for incoming invasion. but Kisa only responded with a sly smile, for she knew that her foe has made a critical error of judgment. It was clear that, after analyzing previous Uesugi invasions, the shogun considered Akatani forces to be inferior to his in all ways. What's more, he believed that Mayans, like before, possessed no fleet, and therefore he could use his own, relatively small one to secure the way for his massive invasion force. With that in mind, Nippon's fleet rushed towards the strait between their homeland and their foes, but were surprised when a similarly sized navy was already waiting for them. Still, Ashikaga sailors, hardened in many wars against lesser daimyos, were confident in their abilities and moved in to attack, but as soon as they committed to this move, another force appeared behind them. Suddenly, shogunate forces were faced with overwhelming numbers, but the attack was not called off. Instead, the fleet commander only ordered his men to attack faster, hoping to break through the smaller force in front of him and escape before enemies behind could catch up. But what followed then could only be described as a massacre. Ashikaga sailors might have been more experienced and battle-hardened, but Mayans had their brass thunderers on their side. Without warning, Akatani ships opened fire, terrifying shogunate crews who never saw weapons like that before and could not understand why their ships suddenly started to fall apart around them. Suspecting some kind of trick, some of the captains tried to fall back and try their luck against the pursuing fleet, but were met with the same fate. The battle lasted less than an hour and ended up in a complete destruction of shogunate force. Most of their ships never even reached the distance where they could counterattack with their bows, and those that did were in such a bad shape that these strikes were almost completely ineffective. By the end of the day, not a single Ashikaga sailor was left alive, as Akatani Navy hunted down all survivors and killed them to ensure that their new weapons would remain a secret. And in that moment, the tables have turned. This time, Akatan was the power that controlled the strait and prevented all forces from the south from launching an invasion. The initiative was now fully on Mayan's side. For several months, Akatani fleet maintained its position in the strait, taunting shogunate forces with frequent coastal raids. But then, all of a sudden, the fleet that was such a thorn in Southern Army's side simply vanished overnight. Expecting a trap, Ashikaga forces held their position for a few days, but when the fleet failed to reappear, they threw themselves at a chance of invasion. Transport ships of all kinds were commandeered, and an army of almost 30,000 men began crossing the strait, although they were forced to do so in turns, for there were not enough ships to transport everyone in one go. But things were not going to be easy for them. Akatani forces used few months bought by their fleet to reinforce all potential landing sites, which forced Ashikaga invaders to land on a single wide beach where their forces had some hope of forming a battle line without being instantly surrounded and slaughtered. But as first transport ships unloaded warriors of the shogun onto the shore, a message came from the back of invasion fleet. Akatani Navy was spotted once again, and it already moved in to intercept advancing transports. What's worse, their presence prevented second wave of reinforcements from joining the fight. The situation suddenly became very troubling, but southern forces continued their advance, aware that the only way out of this situation was to charge on ahead and secure position in Hokkaido before forces of Akatan could surround them on the beach. As such, a line was formed and the army advanced, but Mayan force was already waiting for them, and in that very same moment, their line of Zantikan handguns and brass thunderers opened fire, tearing apart leading Ashikaga columns. The sand on the beach was turned red by blood of advancing soldiers, who were shocked to see these new, outlandish, devastating weapons in action. The first assault group was wiped out in minutes, but managed to buy enough time for the rest of the force to land and form up for a deadly attack. 4 times Ashikaga forces advanced up the beach. 4 times they were pushed back, leaving behind hundreds of dead and wounded, but each attack, like waves of the ocean, came closer and closer, and finally, at the very end of the day, the 5th wave reached Akatani line, which was completely unprepared for the ferocity of this attack. which, as it happened, proved to be decisive in this battle. During previous Uesugi invasion, most of Akatani force was composed of warriors who used melee weapons, heavy blades or clubs or spears, but the new Mayan force was so obsessed with their firearms and cannons that it considered melee training as a secondary or even tertiary issue, and so its soldiers were unprepared to receive a charge of furious shogunate samurai who completely decimated front ranks of Mayan force. Seeing that it was his forces that were being slaughtered now, Akatani commander wanted to order a retreat, but realized that with his cannons, such a maneuver would take far more time. And so, despite his instincts, he ordered his men to fight on, to buy Brass Thunderers enough time to flee. His men paid a heavy price for it, and as the sun set, Mayan line completely collapsed, unable to hold against terrifying warriors from the south. Fortunately, the night itself proved to be a foggy one, which allowed Akatani troops to retreat, but at this point their morale was completely shaken. Despite their new weapons, despite their fortifications and support of their fleet, their foes still managed to defeat them, and at the very least, they knew that no pursuit would come after them, for Shima Fortress still stood strong, ready to prevent all further incursions into Hokkaido. But in the end, the battle itself could only be considered as a defeat for both sides. When it was finally over, the field it took place on looked like a scene from a nightmare, as both sides suffered heavy casualties. Nippon steel wielded by Ashikaga warriors was devastating against lightly armed Akatani troops, and so places in which both sides clashed in close combat were littered with severed limbs, heads, discarded weapons, and even men cleaved in half by powerful swings of katanas and naginatas. But in front of that scene of bloodbath, the field looked just as bad. The ground was covered in crumpled bodies pierced by metal rounds fired from Zati guns. It was a revolting sight, both after and during the battle, simply due to sheer murderous potential of these firearms. Before, when an advancing warrior was struck with an arrow, he would simply fall forward, face first into the dirt. Sometimes, a man pierced with a deadly arrow could even still take a few steps out of sheer momentum of his charge. But Akatani gunpowder weapons changed it. They were so powerful that every time they struck a foe, said foe would be knocked backwards or spun around, or sometimes even lifted off his feet and thrown into comrades behind him, further increasing chaos of advancing under enemy fire. It was even worse when Brass Thunderers opened fire as well. Entire rows of men lying in the field, crushed or ripped apart by cannonballs they had no protection against. Those struck by Akatani mortars were usually unrecognizable, turned into a gory mess of blood, bones, guts and armor. For samurai warriors of Nippon, such death was one of the worst they could imagine, a dishonorable, anonymous death, inflicted by a distant or even unseen enemy, obscured by a cloud of pale smoke, which could explain the fierceness with which Ashikaga warriors threw themselves at their foes when they could finally reach them and engage them in proper combat. But despite their fury and despite their technical victory, invading forces were not out of the woods yet. Their first attack was successful, true, but they paid a heavy price for it. What's worse, they were now cut off from home and could not advance because of a Shima fortress standing in their way. The only way they could survive this situation was to capture said fortress and use it for themselves to buy time for the shogun to commission a new fleet that could relieve them. But within days of arriving at Oshima and setting up a siege camp, Ashikaga commander realized that his situation was hopeless. His men were wounded and hungry, and so he had to send many of them into surrounding areas to find supplies, which was a risky proposition at best, as Akatani forces that retreated north left behind small groups of skirmishers to harass the invading army. As days went by, it became clear that without support from home, the siege would last for months, and by that time, Mayan army would no doubt regroup, reinforce and counterattack, which was precisely what happened. And like in case of Uesugi invasion, the attack came only after the worst cold of winter has passed. The freezing winds and hunger did most of Akatani work for them, and by the time relief forces arrived, shogunate forces were no longer proud, fearless warriors, but a mob of shivering, starving men, fully aware of hopelessness of their situation. Yet, despite being caught in a pincer attack between Mayan main army and garrison of Oshima, despite being barely able to stand up and hold their weapons, Ashikaga soldiers fought with suicidal bravery, and Mei Akatani troops paid dearly for their victory. But said victory was inevitable, and once again entire invasion force was wiped out to the last man, both as a warning to future enemies and to ensure that word about new Mayan weapons would not spread around too fast. It was a victory Mayans have sorely needed, and one could say that it was a cause for celebration. The invaders were repelled, their army was destroyed, and Akatani fleet ensured that any further attacks could easily be prevented, not to mention that, thanks to control of the strait, the initiative was now fully on defenders' side. And, in fact, most people have celebrated, as weapons of their fallen enemies were brought to the capital to be melted into more cannons, and southern commanders were sacrificed on the altar of the royal temple. But some people were distant during these celebrations, including Queen Kisa herself. For a mere few days before, she welcomed back one of her most distant expeditions and received their report. They crossed the great ocean to the east and found a myriad of small islands that could easily be colonized and exploited by the crown. But more than that, they have found their way home. They found a great continent far in the east and followed the shoreline down south until one day they found a place described in diaries of first Akatani king, the place where floating pyramids were launched from. The expedition could not believe their eyes. They have found their mysterious homeland after over a century away. Excited, they came ashore to investigate and to make contact with the locals, hoping to learn something about the motherland they have searched for so long. But what they found was beyond their imagination and beyond their worst suspicions. Within days, they were forced to flee and rushed back home to deliver these disturbing news to the Queen. And so, Kisa Arana was distant during victory celebrations, for she realized that she failed. Her mission, the mission of entire Akatan, was to restore broken Mayan civilization that fell apart during darkest days of chaotic winter. But that report of expedition commander has torn that hope down. The motherland could not be restored, for it was no longer there. It was already consumed by chaos and darkness, and the people that inhabited it were Mayans no more. There was nothing left to save.